Hello, good evening, and whatever words accompany that. A little bit later stream today than usual. Few other things didn't quite work out this morning as I'd hoped. But today I'm going to be doing the final stream that's kind of anchored around the stuff that I put together and the process that I went through for getting my successful grant application happening. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get permission to share my external assessment, but we'll be talking about my responses to the external assessment in isolation to whatever extent we can. First up, I would like to talk more generally about feedback. Hey Darganom in chat, good to see you. I hope that you're well. Yeah, haven't had a catch up for a while. We should have a talk sometime. But yeah, so I think it's more useful to talk about how I go about approaching interpreting feedback and how I go about responding to feedback before, like in general, before discussing how I went about handling the external assessment in particular. So the deal with the external assessment is that I submit my application and a few extra bits and pieces, and then the grant organization contacts somebody in the industry to look over the application and give some perspectives that aren't ideally don't come from somebody who's worked with me in the past. And then I'm given the opportunity to respond to that. So while it's a very different context, like it might have more in common with defending a PhD than responding to just people on the internet telling you what they think of your stuff unsolicited. But I think just like the general approach and general perspectives and general attitudes towards what feedback is useful and what feedback is not useful still kind of come into play a little bit at least. So yeah, let's talk about feedback in general. Yeah. So this is I might give this as a talk somewhere else. I mean, I don't need to introduce myself. This is my own stream. And like you already know the stuff that I do if you're here. And if you don't, we're going to be talking about that later. But yeah, so we're going to be using examples from a couple of projects. This mentions that the stuff that I've quoted has been quoted with permission, and I've gotten permission to quote a few things, but I didn't end up quoting them in my slides here for now, so let's not worry too much about that. Of course, this is how I handle feedback and how I respond to feedback. Everybody works a bit differently, so this isn't necessarily advice, it's just a set of perspectives that may or may not be useful to you. So there's a whole bunch of different types of feedback. I'm going to kind of be talking in general about all of them, because I feel like I have a way of assessing them and a way of addressing them that is not particularly, like, it applies to all of them, I guess. But I think that you generally give different stuff weight depending upon what kind of context it's given under. So if you go out and you ask someone to tell you what they think about your thing, that's soliciting a critique. That's going to be a slightly different context to people coming to you with their thoughts and feelings and suggestions when it hasn't been solicited, like when you haven't asked for them, because you may not want them. And then if somebody comes to you with like bug reports or complaints, like that's still potentially going to have some feedback that's going to be useful in that sense, in the same sense that an actually solicited critique might be useful, but it's still a different context because you're dealing in general. You're dealing with a customer who has something that needs addressing, and so you want to give that some attention, and you have some responsibility to maintain some kind of reasonably positive relationship with your customers, I guess. Like, when I say relationship, I mean it's definitely not a close personal relationship but it is a relationship that you end up having in a more general sense. And same with requests for changes. Like if somebody comes to you to demand that you implement a feature that they want, that's another situation again. Again, if it's a customer, then maybe you might feel some obligation to give that more consideration than if it's not. But it's still a different context, and you kind of approach it a little bit differently. And then there's also, in addition to complaints that you might get as part of support requests, you might also get support requests where, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, I think, where someone says, "Oh, I didn't like how this thing happened," or I found this bug. What they're seeing isn't a bug, but it is an indication that something has given them the wrong expectations, or led them to assume that it's a bug. So, you can find some useful feedback hiding in there as well. But yeah, we're gonna push all those together into one thing. And so it is important to weigh up and consider what feedback is going to be useful, because like a lot of it's not. A lot of there is a definite signal to noise ratio, and working out how to dig through that is an important part of both efficiently navigating interacting with your users, and other people that you ask for feedback from, but also a way of kind of looking after your mental health as well, because when you publish something publicly, every man and their dog feels entitled to direct their opinions at you, even when some of those opinions would be better suited for their own blog or their own local social sphere. So like working out what you want to pay attention to and what you don't want to pay attention to is I think it's really important. So I have a bunch of questions that I ask myself whenever I get a piece of feedback, and this is we're gonna run through each of those. So the first one is the feedback dependent on false assumptions? And so this is about identifying whether or not the feedback is just not relevant, right? If it's asking for something that's already addressed or already exists, or is a result of someone, like I've got this example here where someone has said in a public, this is in Hive Times comments, they say, "Please add a manual save button when I'm playing and suddenly I have to go, I have to wait 10 minutes before it will autosave. Manual save, please." And obviously Hive Time has manual save features. You can go to the main menu and you can do a manual save there. You can press the quick save button if you want. Like, you've got a couple of options there which I think are a good fit for just about any context that you need. And then the auto saves are sort of meant to be this backup on top of that in case you forget to do a manual save and have a power failure or something. And at this point, like you kind of you go all, those things are already there. Enjoy. But at the same time, the question is, should those buttons be surfaced somewhere a little bit more obvious? They're in the controls menu, and they're rebindable. If you just press escape to pause and go back to the main menu, there's a save option there. I feel like they're fairly, like for that example in particular, I decided to not make any changes to the game because I feel like that stuff's already as prominent as it needs to be. But it's still a thing to think about. Is like, can I interpret something of value from someone getting the wrong idea? Yeah, and in this case in particular, I sort of feel like if you realize that you want a save button and you haven't gone looking to see if there's a save button, then to some extent that's on you. And it's fine. Like it's also like a very strong convention to have a save option on the pause menu. So yeah, for that reason, I felt like it wasn't really worth addressing. But I responded to the person and said, here's where you find the manual save option. Here's the default buttons for quick save and quick load. Hope that helps. There's no need to tell people that they should. you don't need to tell people that they should be doing better. But we'll touch on that a bit later as well. So yeah, the first one is are there any kind of false assumptions there about how things work or what things do that make that feedback less useful? The second one is the feedback responding to your project? Because around it, I say this a lot, around any given any given concept, there is a near infinite number of interpretations of that concept. Oh, hello. Where's the thing? There it is. Press the wrong button. There's a near infinite number of possible projects that surround any given concept. And so when someone plays something, they may be having their own ideas about what the game should be that aren't the game that you are making. And that's fine. It's particularly an issue when you're inviting people to, check out something that's still in development, because it will have rough edges and things that aren't there yet, and there's if it's in development, there's an implicit assumption that there's going to be further development and things are going to change, so that opens up the idea of there being room for someone's imagination to try and fill in the blanks and speculate about how it's going to change. But it still ends up being a thing for released games. You'll get feedback from people who are, one that stands out in my mind is that there was someone who had some very strongly worded feedback about Hive Time and very demandingly requested a bunch of features that would have moved the game away from being a management sim and toward being an RTS. So they wanted to be able to control bees as units and have select a bunch of bees and go and attack wasps and stuff, and have some degree of micromanagement over that. And I'm kind of yeah, that's not the game I'm making. It's just not it's not relevant. I had someone say that they really didn't like that Hive Time had this anthropomorphic presentation where the bees have chairs and hammers and saws and tables and human things, but Hive Time as a game is specifically allegorical, right? It's about human communities and the concerns that face our generational communities. It's definitely not about bees. Bees are just the pretty face of that that analogy, And so yeah, someone's saying, oh look, the bees should be more realistic and they should do this, and the queen should lay eggs, and there should be drones, and it should be reflect all of this real stuff about bees. I'm yeah, that's a valid game, and it could well be a very interesting game, could be a game that I could be interested in making, but it's definitely not what Hive Time is. And being able to recognize, or at least think about whether or not that's the case early on in before you invest a lot of time in taking on board feedback, if you kind of can look at it and say, yeah, this really isn't the project that I'm making, you can nip that in the bud, right? You can just kind of go, yep, I don't need to stress about this. I don't need to pivot my project to match these suggestions and this feedback. It's okay for me to discard it. But at the same time, you may be able to glean from this kind of feedback. You may be able to glean some ideas about how to better set expectations. So in those two examples, look, I don't think that there's much I could do. Those players clearly wanted something different than what Hive Time was advertising itself to be, and I don't feel like there's anything that I need to do to the game to convince people that it's not, that it isn't a management sim and that it deserves to be a management sim. I think it's fine where it is. But I'm also reminded of a piece of Bonesweeper feedback that I got that was clearly from somebody who hadn't played Minesweeper before, and didn't really understand any of the genre conventions that my goodness, I'm going to close my email because I'm sick of seeing all the all the notifications there. Yeah, it's really interesting. In the prototype, obviously, I don't want to spend a lot of time tutorializing stuff. There are some instructions, and you can read the instructions. I don't think they read the instructions, like based on what they were saying. It seemed fairly clear that that they didn't. They talked about how they enjoyed the experience and they really liked it and thought it was really cool. And then said they had some questions, and the first question was like, "What are the numbers?" And it's fine, right? Like in the tutorial, I didn't want to. In the prototype, I didn't want to invest a lot of time in tutorializing things, so that it's not really a priority. But they went on to offer a whole bunch of suggestions that were definitely not about embracing the Minesweeper genre, which is the core of what Bonesweeper is. So from that perspective, I felt like that feedback was it was not useful to me in terms of working out what the prototype needed and what the prototype didn't need. But it was definitely interesting to see from a perspective of how does someone who doesn't have the genre literacy approach the game? What do they understand? How do they interpret things? And some of their comments might inform how I approach tutorializing things in the full version of the game. So yeah, even though this type of feedback may often be not very applicable and not very useful, I think there's still some value that you can potentially draw out of it, which is worth keeping an eye out for. It's kind of interesting. And then we have like this kind of middle one, which I think you need to already invest a bit of time in trying to understand what the feedback is before you get to a point where you can answer this question. But like, is the feedback given in good faith? And another sad reality of releasing things publicly in the current climate is that you will get people who are not giving feedback in good faith. And this can come in a couple of different forms. Let's say that you're a visible developer who's been visible as working with some other developer that happens to be the focus of the internet angry man zeitgeist's anger at that point in time, and some of that's going to spill into your own work. Being able to recognize that it's just coming from douchebags who are trying to make your life less pleasant. Identifying that sooner rather than later lets you just push it out of your mind. It can be hard to identify. Because a lot of people who are making it their hobby to try and make other people's lives unpleasant are, investing time in trying to think about the best ways to achieve that without immediately getting banned or immediately getting ignored. But I do find that when there's excessive sarcasm, excessive passive aggressiveness, even excessive hyperbole tends to push things that way. It's like it becomes pretty clear pretty early on that that people aren't chasing positive outcomes, right? And I'm kind of like, if you're not in a position where you want to help me, then you're not entitled to have me engage with you, right? Like, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but to some extent, or to all extents, I guess, if you're offering feedback, if you're giving critique, in order to give effective critique, you need to deliver it in a form that it can be received in. And if you're not interested in doing that, or if you fail to do that, you fail to give good criticism, right? Like you failed as a critic. And it doesn't mean that you can't try again. Doesn't mean that you can't learn from that and improve. But the onus needs to be on you as the person giving it, particularly when it's unsolicited, to give it in a format that it can be received. If you say hello to someone in a language that they don't understand, and you knew that they weren't going to understand from the beginning, then that's on you. I feel like you need to have some. If you don't have a reasonable expectation, if you don't have a level of familiarity where you can kind of guarantee that, whatever abrasive presentation you're giving your feedback is going to be favorably interpreted, then just don't, right? Like if you're not there to give someone the what's the best way to explain this? Like when you give feedback, it's about supporting someone. It's about giving someone something. And if you're not interested in them receiving that, then why are you giving it to them? Right? If you're not going to put effort into making sure that it is received, then why are you sending it out there? That's you just looking after your own interests. Which, like, if you're pleasuring yourself, do that in private. But yeah, I find another thing that often makes this kind of feedback stand out is that when someone will have a list of complaints, and if you address those, then instead of acknowledging that those are addressed, it's a different set of complaints, so that they can continue pushing that same kind of confrontation through their continued interactions. And there are a couple of examples of that on in the Hive-Time comments. I don't want to like point at them specifically, but yeah, I don't know. When I see people being douche canoes like that in public, I'm kind of like, well, you're making yourself look bad, mate. I don't really need to do anything to shoot you down. You're kind of shooting yourself down by being an idiot. And then the other one is unwillingness to follow instructions. So like if someone says they've got a problem and I'm like, sweet, I understand that you have a problem, I'm sorry to hear that, can you send me this, this, and this? The third time that I ask them to send me this, this, and this, and they don't, then that's a pretty clear indication that it's not going to go anywhere, and then that feedback's just not worth giving attention to. So coming back here, the next question is, what does the feedback reflect? And I think this is sort of the where the bulk of your time and energy goes when it comes to interpreting feedback. And I kind of wish I could get a little bit more detailed here, but if we're talking about like a just general approach, it kind of doesn't make sense to get too detailed, because all of this stuff is just highly project specific. It's like it's all down to what the project is and what the project's identity is and what the project's design goals are and what the project's implementation is. But some examples of this are like people asking for population controls to be on the HUD in Hive-Time, and like so I'm thinking in particular of, there was one person who asked for that, and I sort of explained that the whole conceit of Hive-Time is that the hive is your interface and you interact with the hive in order to interact with the game, and so putting stuff on the HUD works against what I want the game to be, so it's like definitely not something I'm going to do. So maybe that feedback was like them wanting a different game, but thinking about what their concerns were, I was able to add in a shortcut where instead of going through the radial menu to bring up the population screen or any other management screen, I added a shortcut where you press a shortcut key over the particular cell type, and it will bring up the relevant management screen for that cell. And I shot them that a patch with that change in it, and they were very impressed and said that they were really happy with how that streamlined the experience, and it addressed the things, the concerns that they had without compromising my vision for the game. They thought that was really cool. But I feel like that's a really good example of how, someone says, they say they want this thing, but what it reflects was not that they want that thing, but they are finding the process of getting to, process of navigating the interface to be a little bit slower than they wanted, and there were other ways to address that. I think Darganom's saying in chat that there was some feedback they received that came down to the mod doesn't work, with no further elaboration when it was asked for. And it's like, yeah, if people aren't going to provide you with the information you need to track a problem down, you can't track a problem down, and it's better to, like, I always ask people for logs and stuff, and when I leave it a month, and if I don't hear anything, I send them another thing and say, hey, look, I didn't receive any of that stuff. If it came my way and if you sent it, I haven't received it, please let me know, and I'll we'll try and work out where that's disappeared, but mostly it's just a reminder to get them to send it again. And if they don't respond, then it's fine. You know, I can mark that down as a here's a problem that I haven't got enough information on to follow up on. But if somebody describes similar symptoms and I'm able to get more information out of them, maybe later on down the track I can get some kind of solution addressing that. But yeah, it is. Let's say it's frustrating. Let's say it's very frustrating when people are kind of uncooperative in that way. I often find myself wishing that I had. Oh wow. Okay, never mind. Yeah, I often find myself wishing that I had, some analytics stuff or built-in like data harvesting stuff so that I could get, whenever the game crashes, like have it automatically upload logs and stuff. But I feel like it's not cool to add. Yeah, I just feel like that kind of stuff's immoral when it's opt out. If it's like, if you're using Unity, for example, like Unity has like all that data harvesting stuff set up by default, which is like, I don't know, it's not very cool. And I don't want to do that. So I'm reliant on people's time and energy and interest in, having positive outcomes to get there. But yeah, like, so there are some other examples that stand out to me. One is there was someone who played all the way through Bad Egg, and they got to the end, and I was like, wow, that's great. And they were like, yeah, but I lost like 14 lives or something. And I was like, wow, okay, so like, I hadn't really thought much about that, because like when you finish the game, it shows you like a summary of how many friends you rescued, how far you traveled, how many tokens you picked up, and how many lives you lost. Initially, I had, I think I had lives gained on there initially, but I was like, that's not really interesting, because if you got to the end, then you've gained at least as many lives as you've lost. Oh, sorry, it was on the game over screen when you don't get to the end, right? Like when you lose. Sorry, that's what led me to remove lives gained, because lives gained was always had a very static relationship to lives lost. If you died because you ran out of lives, and no matter how many you gained, you always lost more. So it's better to just show just one and not both. I think was what I decided. But that change ended up carrying through to the end screen, which meant that this person had spent a long time working through the game and growing their skills and playing really hard, and the end screen just told them how many times they died. With no context, and so it's like, you died 14 times, sure, but you like collected enough stuff to get 15 lives or whatever. Yeah, I updated the game over screen to show how many lives you gained, so that lives lost has a little bit more context that allows you to view it a little bit more positively. And I'm not sure whether that particular person played through again and offered any feelings on that side of things, but I've since seen other people finish, and they seem to respond positively to seeing how many lives they gained. So that was like an interesting thing. There's another game that I worked on called The Away Team, which has it's primarily this text-based thing, which is sort of turn-based because the text only progresses when you make a text choice. But then between these text-based missions, you've got this real-time exploration sequence, and during the real-time exploration sequence, you consume food, and a large focus of the game is dealing with not having any food. I think the game's like one sentence pitch is something like it's a game about cannibalism in space. So that's something we want to keep. When I first came on board on that project, there was a lot of feedback saying that people really didn't like that that food was consumed in real time, and part of the part of the Lost Exodus update was or part of the stuff that I did in the Lost Exodus update was to bring emphasis back on reminding players that the exploration sequence is real time and that time is constantly ticking. And there are a bunch of different ways I sort of tried to surface that. There's a clock in the corner now, and a few other extra tooltips to tell you that food gets consumed over time. And while there are still a lot of people who don't like that food is consumed in real time, I think the number of new complaints about food being consumed in real time dropped dramatically when we shipped that update. And what I think that boils down to is that people have a first impression, right? The first time that they notice that food is consumed in real time is when they run out of food, because they're not, staring at the values on the HUD. They're busy looking at the space that they're exploring. And when you introduce a concept like that, then that's never going to have a positive context, right? Whereas if you've started the game and have noticed that the food is being consumed, you go, oh yeah, food is being consumed, and then when you've run out of food, it's not that same kind of unpleasant surprise, and you've got a different context within which to absorb the concept. So in that case, I think this is another example of where the feedback of people going food shouldn't be consumed in real time does not necessarily reflect what the game needs. That there are other ways to manage the expectations and shift the perceptions and stuff. The last example isn't from a game that I worked on, but it's a fairly famous example of Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, which is a game that is it Raven worked on that? But they were doing playtesting, and a piece of feedback they got was that so this is set in World War II. It's World War II, right? I'm pretty sure it's World War II. And there's like the Axis German soldiers and the Allied, either English, I guess English. I don't know. I never really played it. Soldiers, but like you've got these two factions, and they've got different weapon names and different weapon models, but they effectively have the same stats, right? Like the German Luger pistol has the same stats as the Allied whatever pistol, but there's sort of like the assault rifle type, machine gunny type, general purpose automatic weapon, not machine gun, assault rifle, yeah, automatic weapon that you can use, like typically has a grenade launcher on it and stuff. Like it's very very common stable FPS weapon. They were getting feedback from players that the Allied variant, which I think was like a Tommy gun, like a Thompson brand rifle, was underpowered. I think that's the way around it was. And like the stats were identical, like numerically as far as the gameplay goes, and as far as the weapon stats go, they were the same. But they could see in the actual like gameplay, like the data that they were getting from play sessions, that players who had the Allied weapon, players on the Allied team who were using that weapon did less damage, got fewer kills. That the weapon was less performant for those players, but more performant for the players on the other team, even though the weapons had the same values. And so they got a lot of feedback saying, oh, this weapon is overpowered and needs nerfing, or the other corresponding weapon is too weak and needs improvement. And it turned out that the primary contributor to all of this was the weapon sound effects. So it turned out that the Axis weapon had a deeper bassier sound in it, which led players who had it to feel like it was more powerful, and that they were doing more damage when they were hitting it, which in turn kind of gave them a sense of confidence that allowed them to play more aggressively and get more kills. Whereas the people who were using the other weapon felt like they weren't doing as much damage and felt like they needed to fall back and felt played a lot less aggressively. And so that was being reflected in the playtests, which is like it's fascinating, and a really good example of how your games are crafted experiences that have many contributing factors coming together to make the resulting experience, and it's easy to overlook the contribution that some small thing is going to have, but it's a great example of how the player perception of what their needs are does completely not match what it is that the game itself needs. And so, like I was saying before, if you know a lot about the design and you know about how it's implemented and stuff, then you could start to look at what the differences between those weapons were and identify that it was a sound. But if you're just a player and you don't have much knowledge of what's going on, it's easy to assume that that weapons have different different stats, and assume that they're different when they're actually not. So, and that's the bulk of feedback that you'll get on a game is going to come from players who just don't have that level of insight into what it is that needs to happen. But at the same time, even if you do have all of that insight and all of that familiarity, sometimes you're not necessarily going to be omniscient. You're not going to see everything. You're not going to know everything. But yeah, it's really important to sort of sit down and sort of go, okay, well, what things does this feedback represent? What does it reflect if we don't take it at face value? And I think this is just like a really important thing to do, because if you take all feedback at face value, I think you're just going to overlook a whole lot of potentially useful stuff. So the next question I ask myself is, and this is particularly like after release, is the feedback common? And so if I think about when I've worked on games that have had like large audiences, a lot bigger than Hive Time, it's you have so many people playing, and everybody has their own sensibilities, everybody has their own preferences, everybody has things that they like and things that they don't like, and games are just such subjective experiences that what one player wants or what one player thinks would improve their experience, or what may even improve the experience for one player, might make it worse for another player. And so not acting immediately on feedback and leaving it to see whether or not other people have similar concerns and similar perspectives can help make it easier to identify what kind of feedback reflects concerns that affect the majority of players, and that can in turn help you more efficiently navigate the navigate the process of responding to feedback and making changes to your project in response if that's what you decide to do. But yeah, the examples that I've got here are, so I remember when Bad Egg was in testing, there were people who just straight up did not like the nests, and for better or worse, the nests are a very key part of the kind of experience that I want Bad Egg to be, and I feel like that person was outside of my core audience, and it's okay for them to not like it, but I don't think I should be changing the game's identity based on that. I think that just would have been the wrong choice to make. But replacing every nest or every branch with a nest was a low effort change that I could make that made the game more fun and more approachable for that player, and presumably a bunch of other players who also sat in the same kind of outside the core target audience space that player did. So in thinking about what is this feedback, does it apply to my project, blah blah blah, is it common, this particular concern was not common, but it ended up being something that I was able to add with I don't know, I think it was 20 minutes or something to add that functionality, and I think it probably made the game approachable to a wider range of people. think that was worthwhile. I have middle click and drag is the default panning behavior for Hive Time, but I had one player who was asking whether or not they could have the game pan when they got to the edge of the, like, move the cursor to the edge of the window to pan it around. And I was like, yeah, sure, I can do that. You know, took a little bit of time, and nobody else had ever asked for it. But it wasn't like disrupting a whole bunch of game systems. It required a little bit of fiddling on the HUD, but yeah, it wasn't too hard to implement. And I was able to put it in a patch, and it made them happy, and you know, makes me happy to have it in there as well. I had another player who was asking for, you know, they made their first queen, they made the second queen, and then they're like, well, now what? You know, I tried this royal decrease thing, and while it's interesting, like, it's just not giving me enough to care about. They had a whole bunch of feedback, and you know, we had a big discussion about that, and that was interesting. I think for both of it was an interesting discussion. But one thing that they came back to, like, and this is part of this is on me, because it's like, this is the game that I wanted to make, and I don't know that now is the right climate for that game to be existing. But primarily, Hive Time is inspired by the experiences I had of playing the original SimCity and coming up with my own goals, coming up with my own ways of doing things, and making interesting cities and testing the boundaries of the simulation based on player-driven goals. And I wanted Hive Time to be the kind of game where that could happen too. And so I gave that person a couple of examples, like, you know, what is the smallest hive that you can build that is sustainable, and what is the smallest population that you can get the jelly requirement that you need to build a new queen with, or what's the, you know, can you make a new queen without researching jelly production, you know, and a few other bits and pieces. And they were like, oh wow, this is really cool, I'm going to try all these things, but I wish they were in the game. And it's tough for me from a perspective of, if I want the game to be about player-driven experiences, or player-driven goals, or player-set goals, if I want it to be a player-driven experience, then, like, presenting those as checklists makes it not player-driven, right? But we discussed it, and we talked about it, and we back and forthed a bit, and I was like, you know what? I can write these out as suggestions and put them in the Bpedia under the help section, where, like, I can have a topic that's about, like, what do you do? What do you do once you've made a new queen? Like, how do you go about approaching the game? And I was able to present a bunch of prompts. I think I made 9 all up, and there were, like, some that were about trying to min-max things. There were some that were about trying to have aesthetic constraints, and then there were some that were about, I don't remember what the third group was, but there were 3 groups of different styles of objectives, and I gave 3 potential examples for each. And I think presenting it that way as part of a, you know, in the Bpedia, it's like talking about the concept of player-driven goals, rather than just giving you a checklist, you know. And yeah, so that was a way that I was able to take some feedback that I think just was not reflecting what my target audience wanted, and maybe making it a little bit accessible to a broader audience, and that's a lovely typo there. But yeah, like, so thinking about whether or not the feedback is common can help you triage, you know, this kind of stuff, and work out what you want to do. Like, for low effort items, it can make sense. For high effort items, if it's not common enough and it's not affecting the bulk of your player base, that makes it a bit harder to justify. And I think if you're approaching interpreting your feedback with those kinds of concerns, you know, you can better process, and you know, separate out the things that you do want to action from the things that you don't want to action. And on that note, I think this is the last question that I ask myself, is whether or not the feedback is actually actionable. So, like, sometimes you get feedback and it's like someone says, I don't like this, and you're like, well, that's cool, but there's nothing that we can really do about it, you know, or I agree with this feedback and it's useful, but it's not something that I have the scope to do. People would love to see hive time in different languages, and I would love to see hive time in different languages, but I don't have the resources to do localization. So like that's great feedback. It's nice to have. It's good to know that there's a little bit of demand for it, but I can't action it. Like I can't act on it. And so yeah, these were and that's kind of basically the same kind of thing here. Is like in the Bonesweeper prototype, there was let me bring up my notes. Where are my notes? There they are. There was a developer I gave the prototype to, and one of their bits of feedback was asking whether or not I considered having non-square maps for the dig sites, and I was like, yeah, totally. I'm like super on board with that idea. Talking about having undiggable islands in the middle of a play space and like breaking up some of those straight edges along the side of the dig site. I'm like, yeah, that's like I can see the value in doing that, and I think it would make it more interesting as a whole. But it doesn't make sense for me to do that for the prototype, right? A prototype's something that I'm making within the space of a month. I have other things to work on once the prototype is done. I don't want to get bogged down in doing huge levels of polish. I already know and understand that giving dig sites more organic shapes is going to be interesting. I learn nothing by doing that in the prototype. It's just like that's kind of like a really good example to me of a piece of feedback that's good but not worth actioning. Time controls in Hive Time is another one where it's like people have said, oh, I want to have time controls, and that's something that I experimented with very early on, and immediately found that controlling time in Hive Time makes it harder to play the game. It steers players away from observing the hive. Like you go, oh, I'm bored, things aren't happening, I'm going to speed things up, and you press the fast forward button, and then immediately something that you need to respond to will happen, and you won't notice it, and it will, you'll continue on at the fast speed until whatever that past event was reaches a crisis point that you have to react to, and so you miss out on the opportunity to respond to things as they happen, and you miss out on the opportunity to observe what the potential causes are. That, and there's also like performance concerns. If the game's struggling to maintain a good frame rate, if you've got 1,000 bees, if I increase the processing speed, then it's going to be even worse. But fundamentally, this whole idea of like speeding up time makes it harder to see what's going on is a hurdle that I have not found a solution for. I think that the feedback is valid. Like if I can come up with a way to implement time controls that don't work against the game like that, then I would love to put them in. But I haven't come up with a way to do that. And so I think it's really important to, if you find feedback that isn't actionable, write it down somewhere. Keep note of it, because at some point in the future you might have an idea, or you might have a spark of inspiration, or you might do some further development or improve things in a way that allows you to come back and revisit that stuff in a way that benefits the project. So yeah, I think that's important too. That's not what I want to do. I'm over here. So just to recap, if you take the time to think about what the feedback is, and where it comes from and what context it exists in, and ask yourself these kinds of questions, I think it becomes a lot easier to identify what's worth spending time on. What's worth giving your limited attention to, because you're not going to have infinite you're not going to have infinite time or attention. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was responding to feedback, and I think it's really important to kind of note that you're not obliged to respond to every piece of feedback you receive, like in particular unsolicited feedback. Because yeah, like I said before, you're going to get lots of people feel like they're entitled to have a conversation with you, just because you made something that they've played. And often those conversations can be rewarding, but I don't think that you should feel ever obliged to have them. If someone wants support, give them support, but outside of that, you know, if you've shipped a game that's got, let's say it's sold 100,000 copies in the first 6 months or something, and you've got 100,000 people out there who are, let's say that like the churn rate is that only 20,000 of those people are active at any given time. If you've got 20,000 people who feel like they are entitled to have a conversation with you, yeah, you're not going to be able to do that. That's just not. It doesn't scale, right? But I think that there are times where there's value in responding. And so for me, the list is if I can clarify why something is the way it is in a way that might help a player have a more positive experience of something that they've identified as having room for improvement, then I'll give that. Again, like someone wants time controls, and I'm like, yeah, sorry, it's not going to be time controls. I tried it, it didn't really work with the game, and I can't come up with a good way to implement it. Explaining that is better than just saying no, I think. Because you can say, yeah, look, it's a good idea, but just don't have a good way to do it. And yeah, offering suggestion on why a change won't be made. That person that wanted to have the population controls on the HUD, I was like, okay, well, like here's why I don't want to do it. Here's why I think it would work against the game's identity and what I want the game to achieve. That made them, I think, a little bit more interested in trying the alternative that I gave them. And there have been other cases. Someone's like, why can't I have the population sliders be in absolute values? Like if I want 15 builders, I would love to be able to put the slider to where it says 15 builders, and not have to worry about these percentages and trying to calculate that out. And I sort of had to say, all right, well, like, it's a little bit complicated because if you've got a population of 100 that is being sustained by a certain percentage of B-sitters, if you go from 0 builders to 5% builders, or 15% builders, that's no longer 15 builders, because by the time everything balances itself out, you no longer have the same number of B-sitters. Like the remaining number out of 100 isn't B-sitter. It doesn't give you the same number of B-sitters, which means that you can't sustain the same population level, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, like that thing becomes like, maybe it drops down to 95 Bs, which means that your 15 is no longer 15, it's now like 14 point something. And how do you communicate that? Like it doesn't really work. So there's no way to like effectively make that work, and I kind of did that in the barracks deployment stuff. It was like an absolute value based on what the population was at the time that you set the slider, and it confused the hell out of people. It didn't make any sense, and it didn't scale. So I think I had a good example of why that wouldn't work. But I think as well, like, it's part of the game's identity of like, how do you deal with fluctuating populations? How do you deal with changing, being able to scale things up and down? Like, you have to deal in these kind of abstract ratios. That's the only way that you can work with these kinds of things. There are times where particularly coming back to some of those like bad faith people that we talked about before, there might be times where you like, in general, my advice is don't engage with those people, because like all they're going to do is suck up your time that you could be spending on something more productive. But there may be times where it makes sense to respond, where you can offer some clarification to future people who find that discussion, and not just those types of people, but also in other cases. So like anytime someone has said that they've had a crash or something in Hive Times comments, and I've come up with a solution for them via email, because like things like crashes, I want people to send me logs, and logs have the path that they're saving to and stuff in it, which is potentially identifiable, so I don't want people sharing those in public spaces. So I invite people to interact with me via email. Once I come up with a resolution, I'll come back to leave a response on their comment that says, after talking it through, we came up with this solution. For anybody else who has similar concerns, here's what you do. So that can be useful, and it can kind of like putting that information out there can kind of safeguard you against future bug reports or whatever else. And then I think as well, like when someone has delivered some good feedback, I think there's some value in saying, hey, thank you, some positive reinforcement for doing it well. Because otherwise you're not doing anything to combat that signal to noise ratio. And there are a few other things that I would suggest keeping in mind when responding, and I guess this stuff is recommendations, despite that disclaimer at the beginning. And like, as a developer, you would ideally expect users to be thoughtful, and to an extent respectful when giving feedback, and I think it's important to reciprocate. If that's, you get out what you put in, right? And if you want to have that stuff, you gotta give it back, right? And so I think first and foremost, like the number one thing for me is that rushed responses result in regret. If you've got some feedback, and if it's, I think, positive or negative, if you've received feedback that has generated like a powerful response in you, it's worth just like stepping back and giving it some time. Leave it for tomorrow. Get some time to process it. Give it some time to air. Don't immediately respond. One thing I like to do is write out a draft, and then let that draft sit, and maybe show it to someone if I'm not sure. Like there was someone who was like super rude and super passive aggressive, in an email that they sent me. They were like, the game should be this, 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 and yeah, just like very rude. But they also had a bug, and I was like, all right, well, I'm gonna ignore all like I'm not gonna. Actually, I wrote out a pretty snarky response, where I was like, well, clearly you have no taste if that's how you want the game to be. It's okay for you to want to play a different, worse game. I don't mind. Why don't you go and make that game? And I didn't send that to them. I wrote it out and then deleted it, and then decided that I wasn't going to respond to any of their suggestions because they were just being a tool bag about it. What I was going to focus on was their bug, which I asked them for more information on and gave them some fixes for, and let me find it, because it. Oh, actually, I closed my email. But yeah, they instead of. I wish I had my email open right now. I don't want to open it because it makes a whole bunch of sound. I don't want to like dots and dots and notifications coming up on my screen. But I don't think they thanked me for fixing their problem. Instead, they said, if you put the same amount of effort into reworking the game, I will be very happy. And I just didn't bother responding to that email. I was like, there are no positive outcomes, right, from replying to that. Yeah, it's like, and part of me is torn because I'm like, if I pull them up and say, this is not how you interact with strangers, this is inappropriate, and I think that you should acknowledge that it's inappropriate. If I say that, regardless of whether or not they have a positive interaction with me, if I say that and it makes them more thoughtful about a future interaction with another developer, then I would consider that a positive outcome. But based on every other interaction that I had with them, I didn't feel like I had the ability to reach them in a way that would make a positive outcome, so I didn't. But yeah, it's just, there are lots of people out like that, and some of it is people having social ineptitude and not knowing how to relate to others and not having very well calibrated social compasses on how to interact with strangers. Some of it is cultural. In particular, there are some sort of Eastern European locations where it is sort of the cultural norm to present opinions in a way that in my culture would present them as facts. And, you know, in the context of where that person is coming from, they are just presenting an opinion, as opinions are always presented. In the context that I exist in, they're being pretty rude. You know, and you know, when I say that, you know, it's the difference between saying this is wrong and I don't enjoy this. I don't have a very good example, but yeah, like I've had other, not with Hive Time, but in other places other contexts that I've interacted with people, and like even in, you know, there've been some times where I've been part of international teams, and I've worked with some people who were just incredibly forceful with how they presented their opinions and stuff, and in the role that I had in the project that I'm thinking about, I had to spend a lot of time smoothing over disagreements and helping other people understand that that person wasn't intending to be as abrasive as they were being. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to communicate to them that, you know, it's a two-way street, and a little bit more consideration on their side of the fence may have improved things. But you know, you can't win every battle. There's a saying that another developer I know, Sanatan Mishra from Witchbeam says, which is that a player is never wrong about how they feel. You know, they may often be very wrong about why they feel it, but they're never wrong about what it is that they feel. And I think that when you're responding, don't invalidate people's feelings, because if something has made them sad, if something has made them happy, if something has made them frustrated, you can't tell them that they didn't feel frustrated, because they did, you know. And I think it's important to when you're responding to someone, particularly if they have been feeling frustrated, that you know, recognize that and don't invalidate it. And as I've said a couple of times so far, that, you know, sometimes a player just wants a game that's different from the one that you made, and that's okay. It's okay for them to want to play something else, and it's okay for you to say that the game that you've made is the game that you wanted to make, and their feedback is not applicable to the thing that you want to make. You know, that's fine. I think that it's worth keeping in mind that alienating players does not really lead anywhere useful, and escalating tensions does generally not lead anywhere useful either. There have been times where I've had to say, okay, I'm not engaging anymore. We can't get anywhere with this. sorry that you've had a negative experience, but this is a game that I wanted to make, and it's time to move on. Which may have resulted in that person feeling alienated and may have resulted in escalating tensions a little bit. But as respectfully as possible, I think that's bowing out a lot more gracefully than banning someone or whatever. And as Drew in chat here says, that someone else's personal context is largely unknowable, and there's a fog of war when it comes to human interaction. Yeah, like 100%. I was saying earlier that, well, actually, I'm going to say in a second, but I was saying earlier that a lot of it's about interacting with strangers, and when we're interacting with strangers on the internet, as you say, like in. Oh, that's interesting. You think that in real life is more complex? I find the opposite. I find that in-person interactions give a lot more cues. Tone of voice, body language, facial cues, lots of things that you are going to have a lot more trouble picking up on in either you've got lots of different escalating or lots of different styles of communications that are different bandwidth along different axes. But if you're just interacting with somebody via email, you've got none of that, and you don't even know. You don't know whether the email that you've received is something that they typed out in like without a moment's thought, or whether it's something that they spent hours deliberating over what to say. Like, there's just so little context you can get. Right, I see. You're saying that that human life itself is more complex. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So in addition, there are a couple extra tips that I wouldn't mind sharing when it comes to giving feedback to others. And I think this is like the mirror image of pretty much everything that I've already said so far. Like, the best feedback occurs when there's mutual trust and respect, and you don't get that with strangers. Like, that's just something that you don't get for free. And learning how to give useful feedback to strangers takes practice. Like, it's a thing that you learn, and it's a thing that you got to work on, and it's a thing that you got to be thoughtful about. And so here are a couple of things that feel important to me. So the first one is consent, right? If you're giving someone unsolicited feedback, just ask if they're happy to receive it, and that doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't diminish your feedback in any way. If they say no, like, you haven't lost anything, because they were never going to listen to your feedback anyway. So yeah, do that. And I think it's probably worth considering that if you do take the time to ask someone if they're happy to receive your feedback, that you do start to create a context where there can be, you create the grounds where some degree of mutual trust and respect can start to emerge. You're showing that that you're willing to respect their desires to not receive feedback if they don't want it. And I think that that's a good show of good faith. I think as I was saying earlier, that the onus on you as a critic is to deliver your criticism in a way that it can be received. And that if you're not doing that, then you've failed and have room for improvement. So, like, if you keep that in mind, then that implies that you should be thinking about, like, how can I deliver this based on what I know of the person that I want to give feedback to, whether that's what I know of them through the work of theirs that I'm giving feedback on, or other interactions that I've seen them engage in. How can I best deliver the feedback that I have in a way that they're going to receive it? And, like, the example I was using before is, like, if you know that they don't speak a language, giving them feedback in a language that they don't speak is not going to lead to your feedback being received. So like, there are times where and even that's not like a great example, because sometimes giving feedback in, if you're, giving feedback in your native language allows you to preserve the nuance of your native language that might be lost if you try to express the same thing in a language that you're less familiar with. And it's a bit easier to get that nuance from a translation, if that translation is done by someone who can convey that. So like the foreign language thing is not so good an example, but just broadly, like if you're not committed to the idea of giving feedback and having the feedback that you give be received, then why are you giving it? If you don't care about whether or not it's received, then just don't give it. It's fine. It's important to keep in mind that people, it's okay for people to make stuff that doesn't align with your tastes. There are times where there might be a boundary that that is crossed that you want to speak out about. Maybe there's some game that has some kind of hate speech that really doesn't need to be there, and you feel obliged to speak out about it. But like, more often than not, there's more value in talking about that to other people than directing that at the creator. In terms of like, what are your outcomes? What are you hoping to achieve? If you're trying to convince the creator to change their ways and get different perspectives and different life outlooks and stuff like that, you're never going to get that with a stranger. Like, you got to know somebody to be able to have that level of influence. And if you're kind of campaigning to raise awareness for something, then it's better to broadcast that to an audience rather than just blast it at a creator. I find that when giving feedback, that asking questions always goes more interesting places than saying something specific. And I mentioned that Bonesweeper feedback that I received from another developer, and they said, did you consider non-square maps? They didn't open with, I think that having all these things changing the shape of the dig space would be interesting. I just said, have you considered non-square maps? And by asking a question, you're doing a couple of things. One, you're providing a prompt that invites the person that you're talking to consider things that they maybe haven't considered, but it also gives them an opportunity to express the things that they have considered. And in that way, you get to create a dialogue, and a dialogue is a dynamic thing that can grow and lead to places that you weren't initially expecting. And that's always way more interesting than just saying you should do something like this. So if you ask a question that leads to where the thing that you think would be cool is, and like, even if even if you are more direct and you say, like, have you considered reducing the player health, or have you considered increasing this weapon damage, rather than saying this weapon needs to be more powerful. You can, I think you've just, like, the spectrum of useful positive spaces that you can go from that question is way bigger than the spectrum of useful positive places you can go from saying that statement is. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when giving feedback. And the last one is the metaphorical shit sandwich, which is that if you have something bad that you want to say, or something that you think will be received negatively, it doesn't necessarily have to be bad, that if you put something that you think will be received positively on either side of it, it's a lot easier to absorb the negative thing. So if you open with something nice, and you close with something nice, and you have something less nice in the middle, that tends to have more positive outcomes. And there are a whole bunch of other people who've done psychological papers on why that is the case. I'm not really equipped to explain why it works, but apparently it's fairly effective. And yeah, like, at the end of the day, this is the stuff that works for me. Everybody works differently. That may not work for you. Different people respond better to different types of feedback, and that's pretty natural. Um, and on the flip side, everybody has their own tastes and opinions, and you're never going to find something that is the same thing to everybody. Different people are going to have different interpretations of a project, um, and you're never going to be able to take everybody's feedback on board at once. Like, it's just, you at some level you've got to filter it, you know. And so, yeah, not all feedback is useful, not all feedback is unhelpful. It's up to you to pick through the bits that you think could be of value to the work that you do. And that's it. That's my talk, my general talk on. Well, hang on, we'll leave this here. We'll go back to this recap. So that's my general approach to feedback. And I felt like that was an important piece of context to give, because it helps frame why I responded the way I responded to my external assessment. So to go back and explain what the external assessment was, that was, I submitted my grant application, and then the grant body contacted somebody in the industry to review my grant application and give feedback based upon a couple of criteria. And I'm going to go through those one by one. I'm not going to quote or cite specifically any of the external assessment. What I'm going to talk about is what my responses were and how I arrived at my responses, hopefully. So the first one was about the track record and makeup of the team. And like just broadly, the external assessment had, I think, 3 categories of things. One was like, all the stuff that I cared about was positive. There was a bunch of stuff that I didn't care about that was expressed some uncertainty, or something that I would regard as negativity. And then there was a couple of things that were just false assumptions and not really relevant to anything. So yeah, the track record and makeup of the team, the external assessment acknowledged that I was likely to be capable of the things that I wanted to do. Hang on, I also need to bring up another document here. 8th March. I think this is it. Yeah, okay. So I won't bring my response up on screen, but I will read from it and talk about it. So I opened with my response to the external assessment opened with, I would like to thank the person for spending the time and attention that's clearly gone into assessing both my work, as in my previous games and stuff, and my application. And so for the track record and makeup of the team, I spent some time clarifying things that I have done. There were some questions about specifics of my past work, and so I gave a list of things that I've been involved with, and gave some people that could be reached out to as references. There were some there was some sort of suggestions that even though all of it would be achievable, maybe the quality of the work could be diminished by not having other collaborators. And I thought about this a lot, and I ended up, in my response, I said, In case it wasn't clear from the submission, I intend to do audio as well, building on the experiences that I've had doing field recording, foley recording, and sound design for Hivetime, Bad Egg, and Bonesweeper, the prototype, among other projects. I am an artist and a programmer. It makes sense for me to assign myself art and programming roles. I'm also an audio technician and a musician, and it makes sense for me to take on those roles as well. And I said I haven't decided on a final art style or look and feel for Bonesweeper yet, but I will be making decisions based upon what is achievable with my established skill sets. So far as interactivity and usability go, I'm very comfortable with the minimum bar for quality that my past work demonstrates. And yeah, it's as I said before, I think responding to this kind of stuff has a little bit more in common with like defending a PhD than just responding to random internet comments on a released game, or responding to support requests or whatever. So there are definitely times where I am putting effort into reasserting things, and I want to make sure that I'm being clear about what I've got in what my intentions are and where things are heading. So the next category was the degree to which the concept is innovative, interactive, and achievable. And there was some discussion in there about the difficulty of the prototype and aspects of the prototype that might work or might not work. And I said that, in my response, I said the prototype is tuned for an experienced player and not tutorialized. There are numerous gameplay options in the prototype available to testers and players that I feel address some of the concerns mentioned regarding the build phase, the build or assembly phase, which is what I'm calling it at the moment. The build phase puzzle mode that's in the and the planned presentation for the action mode as described in the concept document seem to address the remainder of the concerns. And so I think in that particular bit, that was me trying to reassert that the concept document explained what my plans were on that front, and that although the tutorial is indicative of the kind of gameplay that I wanted to do, the tutorial is very much about me trying to find the boundaries of what works and what doesn't work, and so it is tuned, as I said, for an experienced player. Highlighting that in the response felt like an important piece of clarification. There was some suggestion that the character designs of should reflect some of the things that are seen in Indiana Jones and Jurassic Park, and it's the more I think about that, the more I'm kind of like, well, the only thing in common between Indiana Jones and Alan Grant are that they wear a hat. There's nothing else at all. Maybe, depending upon how much you want to read into it, potentially problematic favouring of younger women, but I don't think that's where they were going. But yeah, like in the concept doc, as we've seen, there were character customization concept art that specifically referenced some of the costumes from Jurassic Park. So I made note of that as well. And there was also concerns about the UI, and in my responses I said the positive comments I've received on Hivetime's UI, in spite of its shortcomings, make me feel confident that I'll be able to design and implement something consistent and cohesive for Bonesweeper. Interaction uniformity is only relevant when gameplay is expressing similar things. The intention is that each phase has distinct enough gameplay that interaction uniformity is not a meaningful concern. And so again, I'm working to defend the intention presented in the application, that each of the different gameplay modes within Bonesweeper are meant to feel like different kinds of interactions, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to unify those into something singular. And yeah, I felt like that was the right thing to focus on, and in responding to the concerns that were raised there. The next section was the strength of story elements and the quality of the writing. And this is a very difficult one to, both to give the assessment on and to respond to for Bonesweeper, because it's not a narrative focused game. It's not going to have story elements. You know, um, it's certainly going to have. Yeah, it's not going to have a narrative, right? And I don't think it needs or deserves a narrative. The person doing the external assessment has experience in making narrative focused games, and I think that was the perspective that they were coming from. And I think part of interpreting feedback is as much as possible trying to glean what is the context that feedback is arriving in. And there was a suggestion that it would be good to add a strong narrative focus, or some narrative through line. But I think it's very much not the game that I want to make. And my response was that I am skeptical regarding the value of a narrative focus for this game, though I am considering a passing the torch type framing as part of the tutorialization and onboarding content. As an aside, if the tutorial is an older paleontologist, inviting you to help them, with a dig or assemble a skeleton, like that feels like it could give some narrative context to start in. But also, like, I want to make sure that the game gives players room to express and be the character that they want to be. Particularly for this, and like, none of this is in the response. This is me thinking out loud. Particularly when it comes to dinosaurs, many people have deep connections to their enthusiasm for dinosaurs and their own imagined hopes and dreams for, like, everybody wanted to grow up to be a paleontologist, right? At some point. Maybe not everybody. I feel like that's a very common thing. And for people who did want to grow up and become a paleontologist, they had their own vision about how that might happen. And if someone wants to go, well, like, I dream of quitting my accounting job and, like, becoming a late life paleontologist. If someone wants to live that in the game, why should I stop them? Why should I present them with, like, this narrative about being a kid exploring a museum for the first time and falling in love with dinosaurs? If that's not the relationship that the player had with their own enthusiasm for dinosaurs, I think that's potentially undermining a really powerful connection that they can have with the experience. So I kind of lean away from having a lot of explicit narrative framing in that regard. And yeah, I've said in the response, I said strong character designs may be valuable in trailers and marketing materials, though it makes sense to tailor those to the game's assets rather than vice versa. There was a suggestion that strong characterization would make marketing easier, but I think that's putting the cart before the horse, as it were. Which is what I sort of wanted to communicate in my response there. For a different game, I think that would be, definitely, like, a lot of good suggestions and a lot of good feedback in the assessment. But yeah, I think this is one of those cases where it's just, like, not a good fit for the current project that I'm working on. The next category was strength of technical and design elements. And this was another case where I think there were a few aspects of the concept doc that were not, were passed over or glossed over, and that's fine, right? Like, that's a big document, and based on the assessment, I think that a lot of attention was given to the document. It was just this one or two aspects that were overlooked. And I can understand why you wouldn't necessarily give a lot of attention to bits and pieces of concept art, and focus on the text instead. And there might be some paragraph here or there that gets overlooked at the at a page break or whatever. Like that happens. It's fine. But yeah, so I there were some questions about what the research role should be, research phase should be, and my response was that the research phase's design role is to give purpose to surplus fossils and gate content. Its form and presence will be solidified towards the end of production and will be strongly determined by the game's need. It's very intentionally vague at this point. So like the whole idea of the research phase is to like pick up this design slack in the game, and a lot of what it's going to need to do and how it's going to need to function is going to be in response to how the game takes shape, right? Like if I push too hard at solidifying what its identity is going to be at the beginning, then it doesn't, that potentially cuts me off from the value of being able to have it fill in the gaps, So I want to keep it vague and flexible. There was some discussion of fossil rarity as well, and I said that the intended role of fossil rarity is covered in the concept document. If the game is about encouraging people to discover fossils through multiple dig phases, upgrading fossils, or acquiring fossils via research, steers players away from playing the game, and that doesn't align with my design sensibilities. And yeah, like, again, this is me asserting why I think my choices are a good idea, and why I am committed to doing, having the direction that I have for those kinds of things. The next bit was a bit of talking about the museum phase, which is that the concept doc explains that the museum phase will allow the player to navigate a 3D space via a third-person view. At the time that I made the application, at the time that I responded to this feedback, I didn't have the 3D mock-up that we've seen in previous streams. That was something that I made later based on concept art that was in the pitch document. It is easily the largest aspect of the game, which is reflected in the project plan and the budget. After being contracted to work on GD Quest's third-person open 3D mannequin project for a short time, I feel confident that the museum phase is achievable with my current skill set. Yeah, so that was just sort of more uncertainty about what the museum is, and because of that uncertainty is a question of like, what is its scope? How much work does it represent? Because yeah, when something's vague, it's vague, and it might be big or it might be small, and so I wanted to offer both clarification of what it was going to be, and that what I had intended would fit within my within my skill set and be achievable by me. Hooray! And I think we can see from the mock-up that I'm able to put that kind of stuff together. The next thing I said was that the prototype's entire purpose in existing is a way for me to explore the boundaries of what works and what doesn't work within the game's possibility space. Some of the prototype skeletons are intentionally harder to read than others. Readability of fossil chunks will definitely be a priority for the final art style. So there were concerns about how readable the skeletons were, and the skeleton chunks were in the prototype. And this was before I added the difficulty indicators into the assembly phase options as well. So like the Triceratops is easy and the Stegosaurus is medium and the Pteranodon is hard, because those they are. And the Pteranodon was, and the Kunbarosaurus were me specifically going, well, how spindly can bones be and still be recognizable, and what do osteoderms do for readability? Like, is it still possible to play if there's an animal with osteoderms? How much does it increase the difficulty by? And so yeah, like, because I was exploring those things, it led to a perception in the assessment that aspect of the prototype wasn't very well developed from an art style point of view. And I think, yeah, it was very slapped together, but I think I was consciously pushing at the boundaries of difficulty there on purpose. There were questions about whether the text-to-speech support was achievable. Because it potentially represents a significant time investment. And my response was that so far as text-to-speech support goes, I'm not interested in backing down on my commitment to targeting that. Providing alternative gameplay for the prototypes build phase, and wrestling with trying to find an approach for a blind-friendly play in Bat Egg has primed me to understand and appreciate the workload involved here. My interactions with the audio game dev community make me feel confident that I'll be able to find the support I need if I get stuck. That said, Bat Egg is not currently blind accessible. I am capable of stepping back and cutting features in order to make the launch. That's me clarifying that I'm, that's something I am committed to, but also like taking on board that feedback that it does represent an investment of time and energy, and if it turns out to not be achievable, that I have the skills and the perspective, and the project management chops to be able to step back from it if it is the right thing to do. The next section was the potential distribution platforms and revenue streams and the strength of identifiable marketing and distribution opportunities. So something that I had discussed with the grant body but hadn't really included in the application itself was distribution platforms. And so in my response, there were concerns about whether or not I could make back the game's budget on itch, so my response was I had discussed distribution platforms outside of the application process with this person, and when the application process didn't prompt me to touch on that, it slipped my mind. So it's me acknowledging that it's my bad for not giving the details that they said were missing. I said that I am currently intending to ship Bonesweeper as a fixed-priced game on itch. With the amount of work I am intending to invest in the project, I am aiming for a price point of around $15, assuming 30% platform cut. That's still going to fall somewhere under 5,000 full-price units. I feel that this is achievable with my current visibility and momentum as a developer. There were questions, so again there was an assumption that it was going to be another pay what you want title like Hive Time, and so they were asking for like more information on how that went financially, and so I said I have written at length about Hive Time's finances, though I don't think that revenue comparisons to a fixed price project like Bonesweeper make a lot of sense. I included a link to the finances doc. I said Hive Time financially suffered from being a price-optional game during a time when a pandemic and onset of global recession are threatening people's livelihoods. In that context, of course, I am proud to have made something that enriched the lives of people who couldn't afford it during this difficult time. And there were also some strong recommendations that I target handheld consoles, and I said in my response I have no interest in participating in the existence of the console ecosystem. Switch and DS support are firmly off the table, and that's me asserting that it's like there's no way that is going to be a part of my application. I don't intend to do console ports, but if I did anyway, they definitely wouldn't be a part of what I am asking for funding for here. So just like there's no reason to have it be something that's present as part of this this dialogue. The next section was evidence of a high-level economic and cultural benefit to Tasmania, and this is an interesting one. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a sec, but we will go through here. My response was, I have experience working on more commercialized games than Hive Time or my free games, and will continue to seek feedback and advice from my peers in the industry and weigh that within my decision making, as I have been for the past decade or so. So there was a suggestion that I must be operating in a vacuum as far as business decisions go, and that only having experience with free games and pay what you want stuff means that I'm not positioned to make good decisions and recommendations that I should listen to other people in the industry who have more experience. I'm like, that's me saying, well, I have more experience and I always have been listening to other people. So yeah, I guess that's me saying yes to that feedback, but also highlighting that I have a little bit more experience than I was being credited with there. Regarding working with non-Tasmanian contractors, for a project that is tight on time and budget like this, I will only be considering working with other artists that I have already formed a solid working relationship with. For better or worse, all of the individuals that I would consider contracting with on this project are located outside of Australia. So this has been like an ongoing, I don't know if it's a point of contention, but I feel like it was a friction point, which is that I invited Peter, who was Hive Time and Bad Eggs composer, to give me a rate that I could include in the budget for Bonesweeper, so that if I wanted to bring on board an external composer, that I would have a budget for it. There are requirements from the grant body that a certain percentage of the work needs to be done locally, and look, honestly, even if I outsourced all of the music and all of the art, that would still be the case. But I'm not, yeah, I don't think there's any risk of that, which is something that I've constantly been reassuring them with. But I've also said, look, because it came up quite frequently, and I said, look, if this is a deal breaker, let me know, and I'll be happy to withdraw my application. And at no point did they say, that was necessary. But yeah, I'm kind of like, I need to be able to make a game on my own terms, right? Otherwise, what is the point? Yeah. Particularly, I don't want to bring on people that I haven't worked with before, because if I'm trying to make a game in a hurry and its time is tight and budget is tight and everything's stressful, the last thing that I need is to be uncertain about a collaborator, or feeling like I need to budget time to handhold someone through the concept. Which, like, it's possible that might not be the case, and that's not absolutely no reflection on the skills of other people that I could work with. It's just what allows me to work most efficiently and most confidently, and that is working with people that I've already worked with, right? It's just, there's no way to wrangle it differently at this point. So in the response, I said I understand and appreciate the requirements that the bulk of the work be done by and expenditure go towards Tasmanian-based labour. Regardless of whether I bring on external contractors, this would remain the case, with my own labour making up the vast majority of work on the game. If that's not good enough, I will be happy to amicably withdraw my application. So yeah, I wanted to be very upfront about, this is a showstopper for me, and that's okay. If it's not what you want, just let me know, and I'll go off and do my own thing. I said that one of my contacts there had suggested that I also touch on marketing strategies, and I don't feel comfortable locking in specifics until production is closer to wrapping, but in broad strokes, my intentions are to continue to organically grow Bonesweeper's pre-release audience through dev blogs, streaming, and social media, continue to interact with science outreach communities, particularly paleontology-focused, to seek feedback and form relationships with community figures who would be interested in signal boosting closer to release, continue to stay in touch with media who've expressed interest in the project, continue to make small upstream contributions to maintain visibility within the Godot community, submit Bonesweeper to the Godot Showcase, maybe run some competitions to nominate fossil species or avatar customization options for inclusion in the lead up to wrapping production, if that feels like a good idea at the time, establish store presence 3 to 4 months out from launch, possibly experimenting with the new Steam playtest feature that launched in April, ramp up press outreach 2 to 3 months out from launch, reach out to museums and educational institutions 2 to 3 months out from launch and after launch about possible synergies, if that feels like a good use of effort at the time. Signal boost Bonesweeper to my other games audiences by adding patches with Bonesweeper related content where appropriate in the lead up to launch, for example, fossil hats in Hive Time. Maybe do some event streams and key giveaways at launch if that feels like a good thing to do at the time. Support and maintain the game post-launch with patches as appropriate, keeping the game fresh for distribution platform algorithms. Yeah, there was like, I didn't include a marketing strategy in my application, mostly because like this, they're not funding me for like post-production stuff, which I view the primary bulk of marketing is going to be separate from production, right? As a solo developer, it makes sense for me to kind of wrap production and then do marketing, right? There will be some degree of concurrency there, but they're different hats that I wear at different times, and what I'm asking for support for with the application was support with helping to make the game, not helping to sell the game. And so I wanted to make sure that I kept things that were outside the scope of what was being covered by the application and the application's budget out of the application. But the external assessment was asking for more details on some of those aspects, which is fair enough. I think that's what they were being asked to respond to. But yeah, that's how it went. I feel like in broad strokes, my main focuses were clarifying things that were unclear, clarifying things that I was specifically committed to and not willing to move on, and expanding on a couple of those bits and pieces that I felt, initially felt didn't have a place in the application, but were being requested there. And yeah, it was interesting to see another developer from outside of this game's genre giving some thoughts and sharing some thoughts on what it could be. It was interesting to see their interpretation of some different aspects of the project that I think were just not the game that I wanted to make. Even if those things weren't useful to me, it was still interesting. When the assessment came in, the wording of the notification that I got seemed to imply that it was negative. And so when I first read the external assessment, I was quite surprised, because, as I said before, for everything that I cared about, it was quite positive. It seemed to recognize that there was value in the concept, and seemed to offer some belief that the game as a whole was promising and could do interesting things. The things that I didn't care about were, whether or not they had faith in me as a business person, which, I was able to, I hope, give some reassurances and clarifications on, my level of experience and my general attitudes and outlooks, and clarify some of those things that were vague, like, the assumption that Bonesweeper was going to be a pay what you want title that only shipped on itch was off base, and important to clarify if that's something that if that was an assumption that the grant body was making. It was important to have the opportunity to speak to that. So, even when there are bits of feedback that either aren't relevant or don't make sense, or are just wrong, the opportunity to clarify that stuff is valuable. And I think you see this, like, this is like something that goes on at press conferences. If anybody goes to press conferences, you'll find that there'll be people like asking the same thing over and over again, and it's not about ignoring that the answer is being given. It's about trying to get the answer presented in a way that it can then be effectively disseminated to that journalist's audience or all journalists' audiences. So if you ask a question and someone gives like a long rambling answer, that's not a soundbite that you can slip into a piece of news coverage. So if you ask the question again in a more directed way, or ask about it like from a slightly different angle, and you can get something that is more succinct, then that becomes a lot more useful and a lot more usable. And so in a similar kind of way, I feel like the external assessment was an opportunity to kind of ask me questions or prompt me to talk about aspects of my application, or talk about offer clarification about things that otherwise weren't as visible or otherwise weren't as consumable within the application. Overall I feel like it was positive, and the things that were overlooked were either things that I forgot to put in or intentionally didn't put in, or just like tiny things that are super easy to overlook. So there's aside from like the whole thing about whether or not it should have a narrative focus, I feel like everything that I got out of the external assessment was of value and worthwhile. Yeah. I hope that makes some sense. I'm a little bit sorry that I couldn't show any quotes or talk about details, like specifics of the assessment, and sort of dig into how I interpreted particular paragraphs, or how I what messages I got out of particular questions. But it was important to me that I didn't share it if anybody along the chain of people I had to interact with was uncomfortable with that, and in the end it wasn't something that I could get proper approval for, so it didn't make sense to push on that. But what I have shared here is my responses, hopefully done in a way that doesn't reveal anything specific about the assessment that I don't know if anybody is uncomfortable with it. It just turned out that I couldn't get approval, so I did like, it doesn't make sense for me to speculate on on what's going on. And like it is an important thing to acknowledge that when the external assessment was requested, it was requested like it wasn't in a public context, and so I'm asking to be able to share it in a public context. That's like immediately not a guaranteed thing. So I don't feel bad about that, and I don't think anybody should feel bad about it, and I don't think that anybody should feel criticized for I don't even want to say that it was on one particular person. Like I don't I'm feel like I'm painting myself into a corner where I'm talking about things that I don't want to talk about. But yeah, I'm slightly disappointed, but I'm totally understanding, I guess, is where I'm at. And I'm glad to have been able to, that not having that prompted me to write about, put this slideshow together and talk more generally about feedback, which I think was hopefully a valuable piece of discussion and a valuable bit of context when it came to working through my responses to the external feedback there. So, with all that done, I think I'm going to wrap up here. I hope that for anybody who's watching, that this has been interesting. This will be the last stream that is focused on my grant application. It may be that later in development, closer to release, after release, I don't know, at some point down the track, it might make sense to do another stream that is about reflecting on what the process of working with the grant body was like, and how wrapping things up went, but at this early stage, like I feel like it's important to do that as a retrospective, not as some kind of uh, prophetic thing. Like I can't tell the future. I don't know what shape things are going to take. So yeah, I can't reasonably talk about that stuff. But yeah, later on, closer to release, I think I'd likely come back. But for this early phase of talking about the grand application process, that's it. We've gone through the concept document, which described my vision for the full version of Bonesweeper. We went through my budget, which described how I'm planning to expend my effort in developing it. And we've gone through here the responses that I gave, or the defense that I gave my application. And then yeah, like it was successful. I was given the grant that I asked for, and that was really positive, and I'm thankful to everybody who was involved, everybody at Screen Tasmania, and the developer who was invited to do the external assessment. Yeah, very thankful for everybody's time and attention, and I hope that later in the year that I'll have something that will make them feel like they made the right decisions. Only time will tell, though. We'll see. No, I'm feeling pretty good about how it's coming together at the local game makers showcase evening this evening. We do like a bi-monthly thing in Discord. I showed off my showed off my progress, and people seemed pretty happy about it and pretty enthusiastic. Yeah, from that perspective, it seems like things are coming along. I'm a little bit too deep in knowing what my planned outcomes are to be able to feel like the progress I've made so far is reflecting where things are going to be in the end. I can see all the things that are missing, so it's hard for me to say that I've got good progress so far. But if people are excited about it, then that's a good sign. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you for watching. Thanks for the discussion from people in chat earlier. It's appreciated. And moving forward with streams, I'm going to be more focusing on just day-to-day coding and asset creation and that kind of stuff. And hopefully I will be ramping up the frequency of streams moving forward. So if that sounds like fun, if that's exciting, keep an eye out for that. But otherwise, I will see you next time. Excuse me. Yeah, so I'm not sure when I'll be doing the increased frequency, but I think next Friday will be the latest. At the latest will be the next stream. But anyway, for now, goodbye.